Imagine you step outside your front door for less than an hour. The morning is quiet. The yard is fenced. Your 2-year-old daughter is playing in the grass 10 feet away, pushing her little yellow truck back and forth across the dew-wet lawn. You can hear her humming to herself. You can see the gate latch is locked. Everything is exactly the way it is supposed to be. You go for a run. You come back. And she is gone. No footprints leading out. No sound of crying. No broken fence, no forced latch, no tire marks in the gravel. No witness, no fiber, no blood. Just a small pair of shoe prints in the damp grass where she had been standing, and a plastic toy truck lying tipped on its side in the middle of the lawn. As if she had simply ceased to exist between one breath and the next. Search teams would comb those hills for days. Helicopters would sweep the fields. Dozens of volunteers would wade the cold creek and push through the brush in the dark. Dogs trained specifically for missing persons would follow a scent trail 50 yards down the road and then lose it completely, as if the trail had been cut with a knife. Emma Rose Gibson was 2 years old. She had blonde curls and bright, curious eyes and a voice that carried on the morning air like a small bell ringing. She was last seen alive on the morning of the 18th of March, 1998, in the front yard of her family home in Elia, Oregon. Her father was a trained sheriff's deputy with 12 years on the force. And the answer to what happened to her would stay buried for 3 years. It would not come from evidence. It would not come from a witness. It would come from the trembling voice of a 7-year-old girl who could not sleep through the night. This is the case that 247 Studio Missing Cases is covering today. And I need you to stay with me until the end. Because the truth, when it finally came, was worse than anything the search teams had imagined. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel by now, please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons. 247 Studio Missing Cases covers the cold cases the world stopped talking about. The ones with answers still buried somewhere. The ones where a child never came home and someone decided silence was safer than the truth. Like this video. Drop a comment. Now let's dive right in without any further ado. Elia, Oregon sits quietly in the hills of Douglas County. It is the kind of small town that once built its entire identity around the logging industry and then had to slowly rebuild itself when that industry left. By the late 1990s, it was a place of gravel roads and open fields and the particular silence that settles over a community that has learned to expect less than it once hoped for. People knew their neighbors. Strangers were noticed. The kind of place where you assumed that nothing truly terrible could happen, because nothing truly terrible ever had. The Gibson family home stood at the end of one of those gravel roads. A single-story house with a small fenced yard and a swing set that tilted slightly to one side, the way swing sets do when children have used one side more than the other for years. From the outside it looked safe. It looked like the kind of home where the worst thing that ever happened was a scraped knee or a missed school bus. Larry Gibson was 34 years old. He had been a deputy sheriff with Douglas County for 12 years. In the community he was known as steady, clean-cut, dependable. The kind of officer you called when something went wrong, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late and never seemed rattled by anything. He coached a Boy Scout troop on weekends. He went to church. He was, by every account that has ever been given of him, a man who projected total control in every situation he walked into. His wife, Judith, was a quiet and capable woman who ran the household with the kind of calm efficiency that comes from years of managing everything while a spouse works unpredictable shifts. They had 2 daughters together. Karen was 4 years old. Emma was 2. The morning of the 18th of March, 1998, began the way all the most ordinary mornings begin. Without announcement. Without any sign that what was about to happen was on its way. Judith was cleaning the kitchen. The girls were moving in and out of the living room the way small children do, restless and full of their own quiet purpose. A cartoon played faintly from another room. Bright voices. Small laughs. Somewhere behind the house, the creek that ran along the edge of the property murmured steadily over smooth stones. It was the sound of that house on every morning. Nothing was different. Nothing announced itself. Larry had the day off. He planned to go for his usual morning run before lunch. He told Judith he needed the fresh air, that it helped him clear his head. She nodded without looking up from the sink. It was the familiar rhythm of their marriage. He ran to stay sharp. She kept everything moving. The children found their own corners to fill. Emma was already in the front yard when Larry came to the porch to tie his running shoes. The yard was barely 20 feet deep before it met the low wooden fence. To a 2-year-old with blonde curls and an entire morning ahead of her, it was a whole country to explore. The grass was still wet from the night's dew, and her small shoes had left soft prints where she pushed her yellow plastic toy truck in slow, deliberate lines across the lawn. Larry watched her for a moment from the railing. There is something in that image that is hard to shake. A father watching his little girl play in the yard. The morning light. The wet grass. The sound of the creek. Everything exactly as it should be. Judith called from inside that Karen would be out soon to keep an eye on her little sister. Larry said he would only be gone for a short while. 2 miles, maybe. His usual route. He checked the latch on the front gate carefully. He told Emma to wait for her big sister. Emma lifted her small hand, still clumsy with baby fat, and waved. Her voice carried across the yard like a bell ringing. "Bye, Daddy." He jogged down the gravel driveway and did not look back. The road from the Gibson house wound past open fields and then curved gradually toward a dense stand of pine trees. The air smelled of pine pitch and wet bark from the rain that had fallen in the days before. Larry settled into his pace. The kind of rhythm that empties the mind. Just motion and breath and the quiet of a rural Oregon morning. Half a mile down the road, he spotted movement near a drainage ditch at the edge of the road. A gray cat. He recognized it immediately from a neighboring property further down the way. The same cat that had been tearing through his rubbish bins for weeks, scattering garbage across his driveway on multiple occasions. He had complained to the neighbors about it more than once. He had even called the county humane society. But no one ever came out that far into the countryside to collect stray animals. Out here, people handled their own problems. Larry slowed to a stop. He drew his .45 caliber Colt service pistol from the leather holster at his hip and fired once toward the ditch where the cat crouched. The sharp crack of the gunshot echoed through the still morning air and scattered a handful of crows from a nearby fence post. He watched the underbrush for a moment, saw nothing move, and calmly holstered the weapon. He kept jogging. A minor irritation, answered and forgotten. That is how he would later describe it. Before his next breath had fully come and gone. The run took longer than he had originally planned. The road dipped into low marshy ground, then climbed toward a ridge where the forest thickened into shadow. He turned back when he estimated he had covered roughly 2 miles of distance. By the time his feet touched his own driveway again, sweating lightly and breathing steady, his watch read 12:15 in the afternoon. Judith was standing on the porch. One hand raised to shade her eyes against the midday light. Her voice reached him before he reached the steps. Sharp and urgent in a way that did not match the morning. "Larry, is she with you?" He stopped walking. "Who are you talking about?" "Emma. She is gone. I cannot find her anywhere." At first he thought she must be mistaken. He looked at the yard. Everything appeared exactly as it had when he left less than an hour earlier. The swing hung perfectly still. The plastic toy truck lay tipped on its side in the grass. The wooden gate stood open perhaps an inch wider than before. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked like the scene of anything. He called Emma's name. Then louder. Nothing answered him except the wind moving through the tops of the pine trees. He checked behind the porch steps. He checked the small storage shed at the side of the house. He checked the narrow space between the fence and the woodpile stacked against the wall. Judith was already running along the full length of the drainage ditch, pushing through the thick brush and calling her daughter's name until her voice went raw. They circled the house twice together, shouting, and came back with nothing. Larry grabbed the keys to his patrol car and drove up the road with the horn blaring and the windows down, his own voice carrying out across the empty fields. He stopped at the first intersection. Called out. Reversed and came back. Judith was still standing on the porch steps when he pulled back into the driveway. She was crying now. Her hands were shaking. At 12:55 in the afternoon, they called Douglas County Dispatch. 2-year-old female. Last seen in the front yard. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. No known medical issues. By 1:30 that afternoon, the first patrol units had arrived. A volunteer firefighter from Elia pulled his red truck into the narrow driveway within minutes of the call going out. Neighbors followed behind him. Church members. People from Larry's own Boy Scout troop. Strangers who had caught the call on police scanners and come without being asked. Within an hour, the gravel road outside the Gibson house was lined with parked vehicles from one end to the other. The sheriff's office set up a makeshift command post near the mailbox at the end of the drive. Search dogs were brought in from a regional canine unit trained specifically for missing persons. Their handlers led them in slow, methodical circles through the front yard and then down the gravel road. The dogs caught a faint scent trail at the front gate. They followed it roughly 50 yards down the road. And then they lost it completely at the curve where the pavement began. As though the trail had simply ended. As though whoever, or whatever, had carried that scent had been lifted off the ground at exactly that point and transported somewhere the dogs could not follow. Helicopters from the Oregon State Police swept low over the fields and over Swamp Creek to the east. Dozens of men waded through the cold water of the creek, combing through the tall grass along the fence lines, checking systematically under every porch and inside every shed on every neighboring property within walking distance. Orange surveyor's tape marked each cleared zone as the afternoon wore on. By 4 o'clock, the official search grid stretched nearly 2 miles in every direction from the house. Nothing had been found. Not a shoe. Not a single clear footprint leading away from the yard. Not even a broken twig to suggest which direction she might have gone. Teams of dedicated volunteers searched the dense forest by lantern light long after midnight. They found footprints in the soft mud of the creek banks, but none were small enough to belong to a 2-year-old child. As the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the temperature fell noticeably. Hot coffee was passed around among the exhausted searchers in paper cups. Someone offered to drive Judith into town to rest at a friend's house. She refused without hesitation. "She will come back here," Judith said. "She always comes back here when she is scared." At some point in those first crushing hours, Larry went inside the house briefly and came back out wearing his full tan deputy's uniform. His badge was polished. His sidearm was properly holstered at his hip. He told a colleague that it felt right, that he needed to look official, that he needed to feel in control of something. Judith did not respond when he said this. She did not look at him. At 6 o'clock that evening, the sheriff called the search to a temporary pause for safety reasons. "We will start again at first light tomorrow morning," he told the assembled volunteers. "We are not done." The volunteers nodded in the fading light. Before the last of them left, one of them picked up Emma's yellow toy truck from the wet grass and set it gently on the porch railing. As if to keep it safe until she came back. When the last vehicle pulled away down the gravel road and the sound of its engine faded into the surrounding hills, what remained was the whisper of wind through the trees and the terrible weight of a silence that felt heavier than any sound. The kitchen table was still set for lunch. The sandwiches sat untouched on paper plates. The swing moved once in the evening breeze, its chains creaking softly. Neither Larry nor Judith spoke for a very long time. The world had narrowed to the small patch of wet grass where their daughter had last stood, and neither of them could look away from it. At first light on the 19th of March, a fresh search grid was drawn across the wooded hills surrounding Elia. Deputies from neighboring towns joined the effort alongside off-duty officers and volunteers from the local Mormon church congregation. Among the very first to arrive were members of Larry's own Boy Scout troop, teenagers in green shirts and neckerchiefs, carrying flashlights and walkie-talkies, moving through the dense brush in straight, coordinated lines. Each of them called the little girl's name into the fog as though a louder voice might somehow bring her back from wherever she had gone. By mid-morning, nearly 100 people were actively searching. The temperature had dropped further overnight and fog had settled along the ridges, swallowing every shout before it could travel far. Mounted deputies on horseback worked the far muddy banks of Swamp Creek. Larry moved steadily among the searchers all morning. Calm. Methodical. Clipboard in hand, noting search zones on a detailed map, checking off areas as they were reported clear. Those who knew him personally said he looked like a professional doing his job. Those who did not know him found his composure deeply unsettling. One deputy later wrote the following in his official report. He said that Gibson appeared unusually composed for a father in his situation. That he maintained strict control throughout but lacked normal emotional effect. That when asked why he was dressed in his full uniform, Larry stated he needed to look professional for the media coverage. By the second day, the press had arrived from Portland. A television crew filmed the command post from outside the Gibson property. Larry stood confidently in front of the cameras and delivered short, controlled answers to every question. "We are doing everything we can," he said. "Every single minute counts in a case like this." His voice was steady. His face showed almost nothing at all. Judith stood silently beside him, pale and visibly shaken, unable to speak when reporters directed questions toward her. Inside the Douglas County Sheriff's Department, the investigators who had been quietly piecing together the timeline of that morning were beginning to notice something. The story did not hold together. Larry had stated clearly that he left the house at 11:30 in the morning for his run. The route he described, roughly 2 miles through the countryside and back, should have taken approximately 20 minutes at a normal jogging pace. He claimed he returned to the house at 12:15 in the afternoon. That was 45 minutes for a 20-minute run. Nobody could account for the extra time. No one. Not his neighbors, not the landscape itself, not any detail he had offered in any of his interviews. Then there was the patrol car. Larry had used his county-issued sheriff's vehicle that morning, which was highly unusual for a day off. The odometer showed 7 unexplained miles on the duty log for that date. When investigators asked him about the discrepancy, Larry explained calmly that after searching the yard with Judith, he had driven to a nearby rest area to check whether Emma might have wandered that far from home on her own. The sheriff made a careful note of the explanation and did not press the matter. Not yet. A second inconsistency surfaced in the days that followed. Larry had admitted to firing his service weapon that morning, one shot at the gray cat near the drainage ditch, he said. He claimed he had missed the animal completely. When investigators returned to search the area he had described near the tree line, they found the cat dead in the ditch, approximately 50 yards from the road. Not one bullet. 2. Both had entered the animal. One through the skull, one through the chest. Ballistic testing matched both rounds to Larry's department-issued .45 caliber Colt pistol. One detective later recalled this detail in his personal notes. He wrote that people miss their target sometimes, and people lie about small things, but rarely do both happen in the exact same story with physical evidence sitting right there to prove it. Think about what that means for a moment. A trained law enforcement officer. A man who had been firing that weapon for 12 years. Who had qualified with it repeatedly at the range. Who carried it every single day as part of his professional identity. Had claimed to miss a stationary cat crouching in a ditch at close range. Had fired once, he said. Had hit nothing, he said. But the cat was dead with 2 bullets in it, and both bullets had come from his gun, and he had said nothing about the second shot to anyone. By the end of March, the large organized search effort was officially scaled back due to resource constraints. The helicopters were grounded. The volunteer networks stood down. A smaller investigative team quietly took over, reviewing statements and cross-referencing every lead that came through the dedicated tip line. A dozen possible sightings of Emma came in over the following weeks. A blonde toddler at a highway rest stop. A similar child in a grocery store car park 2 counties away. Each reported sighting was investigated and dismissed within hours. And then came the statement from 4-year-old Karen Gibson that changed the entire direction of the case. During a carefully conducted forensic interview with 2 experienced child detectives, Karen described seeing a truck pull into the family driveway that morning while her father was out on his run. Inside the truck, she said quietly, were a blonde woman and a dark-haired man she did not recognize. She said they took Emma and drove away quickly. The truck was yellow, she thought. Or maybe brownish. An older model. The 2 people inside did not speak to Karen. They just took her little sister and left. The statement was documented word for word in the official report. But there were problems with it immediately. There were no tire tracks visible on the gravel road from that morning. No neighbors in the area reported seeing any truck matching Karen's description. No one, anywhere, had seen a vehicle of that kind on that road on that day. Still, the description was released publicly. A tan or gold pickup truck, possibly older model, 2 occupants sought for questioning. For weeks that image was everywhere across Oregon. On posters taped to shop windows. In television newscasts. In the minds of people driving the highways and looking at every truck that passed them. No such vehicle was ever found. Inside the department, the doubts that had been circling quietly among investigators were growing harder to ignore. Officers who had worked alongside Larry for years described him as increasingly distant, emotionally detached, and sometimes visibly irritated when pressed on any detail of the timeline. When he mentioned Emma at all, his voice carried no warmth, no grief, no catch in the throat. Just a flat, controlled stillness that sat wrongly in the room. One deputy remembered walking into the locker room unexpectedly and finding Larry standing alone at the mirror, staring at his own reflection for a very long time. When the deputy asked how he was holding up, Larry did not turn around. "You just keep doing what you know how to do every day," he said. In July of that year, the sheriff placed Larry on administrative leave pending further internal review of the case. Larry accepted the decision without any visible reaction. No protest, no emotion, no sign that it affected him in any direction at all. The investigation continued into the autumn and through the winter, grinding slowly through witness statements and lab results and archived call logs. Nothing substantial changed in the official record. No one had seen the tan truck. No one had heard any struggle or crying. The front yard where Emma had played showed no signs of disturbance at all. No footprints leaving the property except the small ones she had left herself in the damp morning grass. In September, Judith was interviewed again by a different detective. She described her husband as increasingly quiet, increasingly withdrawn, a man who seemed to be trying desperately not to think. She said she wanted to believe the story about the truck. She said she wanted to believe that a stranger had come and taken her daughter, because that explanation, as horrifying as it was still easier to live with than the alternative. But when the detective asked her directly whether she fully trusted Larry's account of that morning, Judith hesitated for a long time before she answered. "I think," she said quietly, "he tells what he can live with." By the winter of 1998, the case had slowed to almost nothing. The Douglas County Sheriff's Office filed its last formal progress report in December. The opening line read simply, "Investigation ongoing. Subject remains missing. No further developments to report." Christmas came and went in the Gibson household in an atmosphere of crushing silence. Karen asked again and again where her little sister was. Judith told her that Emma was with the angels now, then immediately corrected herself, saying they were still looking. Larry said nothing during these conversations. He left the room. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now with what you think really happened that morning. Tell me, do you think the investigators were right to doubt him? Do you think Judith already knew the truth? Leave your thoughts below. Let's see who is truly following this story, because it is about to go somewhere you are not expecting. Subscribe if you have not already. This is 247 studio missing cases, and we are just getting to the part that changes everything. In January of 1999, Larry Gibson submitted his formal resignation from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. The letter was short and typed on official department stationery. It said, "For personal and family reasons, I am unable to continue my duties at this time. Respectfully, Deputy Larry Dean Gibson." The sheriff accepted the resignation without ceremony. When Larry left the building for the last time on a gray January afternoon, a few colleagues stood near the door. No one knew whether to shake his hand or say goodbye or simply let him go. He nodded once. He said, "Take care," and walked out into the cold rain. The patrol car he turned in at the motor pool that day still smelled faintly of disinfectant. Within weeks, the Gibson family was gone from Oregon entirely. No farewell notices in the local paper. No goodbye gathering from the church or from the department. One cold spring morning, their furniture was loaded into a rented moving truck, and by the following week the house at the end of the gravel road stood completely empty. They moved 900 miles northeast to a small town near Helena, Montana. A remote place where no one knew their faces. Where a man could start over without being asked too many questions about whatever it was he had left behind. Larry shaved his mustache. He traded his deputy's uniform for pressed dress shirts and neckties. He found work selling insurance policies for a regional company. He joined the men's group at the local Mormon congregation on weekends, bringing donuts and shaking every hand firmly. He smiled at all the right moments. He said all the right things. Judith brought Karen to church activities and was polite and reserved with the other mothers in the congregation. People said she seemed tired but kind. Her smile, they noticed, never quite reached her eyes. But this was a small town, and people in small towns extend the benefit of the doubt to people who have clearly been through something hard. For a few months, the Gibsons passed as an ordinary family dealing with some unnamed sorrow. Larry paid his bills on time. He volunteered for local scout events. Judith stayed home, and by the summer she was visibly pregnant. She gave birth in August to a dark-haired baby girl they named Lisa, who slept easily and rarely cried. For a brief window of time, it seemed as if they had somehow managed to build something new from what had been shattered. But beneath the surface of that rebuilt life, the silence in their home was growing thicker by the month. Larry did not talk about Oregon at all. When neighbors asked why they had left such a beautiful state, he said only that it had been a hard time for the family and left it at that. At home, he kept to a rigid daily routine. Work. Church. Dinner. Television. Sleep. He spoke very little to Judith. Even less to Karen. When Emma's name surfaced in any form, he would leave the room without a word, without explanation, without a single moment of acknowledgement that anything had been said at all. Judith tried to be patient with what she told herself was his grief. But she felt the distance between them hardening, month by month, like something that had been warm once and had gone cold. Emma's name was never officially prohibited in that house. It simply was never said. When Judith prayed alone at night, she sometimes whispered her daughter's name under her breath, afraid that Larry might somehow hear her through the walls. Karen was now 7 years old, and she did not understand the silent rules that governed their household. She still remembered her little sister clearly. The yellow toy truck. The sound of Emma's laughter carrying across the yard. She still asked sometimes where Emma had gone. Other times she simply woke up in the middle of the night, screaming, saying she had seen Emma crying by the porch, or lying on the ground somewhere she could not get to. One night, half asleep and twisted in her blankets, Karen whispered something that Judith would never be able to unhear. "Daddy hurt Emma," she murmured. "He put her in the ground." Judith sat in the dark and did not move for a long time. In the morning, Karen did not seem to remember having said anything. A few weeks later, Judith was cleaning Karen's room when she found a crayon drawing tucked carefully under the pillow. It showed 4 stick figures drawn in different colors. A man. A woman. A small girl. And another, smaller figure drawn in faint gray, lying near the corner of the page. Above them all, a yellow sun was smiling the way it always does in a child's drawing, round and bright and completely indifferent to what was happening below it. Judith folded the drawing and put it in her dresser drawer. She did not mention it to Larry. She did not mention it to anyone. For those of you who have ever found something you were not looking for, you know that terrible moment when you must decide what to do with it. Whether to open the door it is knocking on, or push it as far to the back of the drawer as it will go and try to forget it is there. At church, the Gibson family story had spread quietly through the congregation in the way that stories do in small communities. People knew that something tragic had happened in Oregon. A missing child. A man who had left law enforcement. A family carrying something heavy and unnamed. The community had offered sympathy at first, casseroles and visits and dinner invitations. Then gradually came a cooler kind of distance. Conversation stopped when Larry entered a room. The warmth turned polite, then noticeably thin. One Sunday after services, the bishop asked Larry directly whether he planned to reapply for police work in Montana. Larry shook his head firmly. "That part of my life is over," he said. He did not mention that the Oregon State Police had kept his file open. He did not mention that the sheriff who had once worked beside him for over a decade now refused to return his phone calls. As the months passed, the marriage came apart at the seams. Larry began spending evenings away from the house without explaining where he had gone. Judith stopped asking. Their arguments, when they finally came, were quiet and precise and left no room for repair. "You do not talk to me anymore," she said one night at the dinner table. "I talk when there is something to say," he replied. After that night she stopped asking questions altogether. By early 2001, the distance between them had become impossible to ignore or repair. Larry had started sleeping on the couch. Judith had begun quietly saving small amounts of money from the grocery budget, writing letters to her mother back in Oregon, making a plan she could not yet say aloud. When she finally told Larry she wanted to go back home for a while, he did not protest. "Do what you need to do," he said, without emotion. In January of 2001, nearly 3 years after Emma Gibson vanished, Judith packed the car with clothes and toys and the baby's things. Karen sat silently in the back seat, clutching a stuffed animal and looking out the window. Larry stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, his face completely unreadable, watching them from the drive as the car reversed out onto the road. "Take care of yourself," he said. Judith looked at him for a long moment from the driver's window. She was searching his face for something she had not been able to find there for a very long time. Then she put the car into drive and pulled away. She did not look in the rearview mirror. The road back to Oregon wound through the same mountain ranges the family had once crossed together. Snow still clung to the high ridges. The radio faded in and out through the mountain passes. Karen slept most of the way with her head against the window. When they stopped for petrol near Spokane, Judith caught her own face in the rearview mirror and barely recognized it. Pale. Older. Like someone who had waited too long to move. They reached Oregon after 2 long days of driving. Judith stayed with her mother in Eugene, sharing a small room with both girls. It was not much, but it felt safer than anything had felt in years. She found part-time work at a laundromat and began rebuilding her life quietly, one day at a time. Back in Montana, Larry lived alone in the empty house on Cedar Street. He kept it clean. He drove to work. He attended church less frequently. Neighbors said he was polite but only half present, a man whose mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely even when he was standing right in front of you. He stopped mentioning his family altogether. In the evenings he sat by the window and watched the cars pass on the road below, the television playing quietly in the background with the hum of other people's lives. No one in Helena ever asked him about the missing child from Oregon. And he never offered the story. Sometimes late at night he opened a small box he kept in a drawer. Inside were photographs. Emma on her second birthday, grinning beneath a paper birthday hat. Karen holding up her first school ribbon. Judith smiling faintly at a picnic, years before everything fell apart. He would look at the photographs for a few minutes. Then he would close the box again. In February of 2001, Karen's school counselor in Eugene, a quiet and perceptive woman named Ellen Wright, noticed that Karen was waking at night and having difficulty concentrating in class. She arranged a private session. She asked gentle questions about home, about family, about what Karen remembered of Oregon before Montana. Karen hesitated for a long time. The room was quiet. And then she whispered something that made Ellen Wright put down her pen. That afternoon, Ellen called Judith to the school. Karen sat beside her mother in the counselor's office and clutched a stuffed animal tightly in her lap. Her words came out slowly, pieced together from fragments of memory she had been carrying somewhere inside her for 3 years. She said Emma had followed Daddy outside that morning. She said Daddy was mad. She said he told Emma to stop, and then he hit her. She made a quick striking motion with her hand to show what she meant. And then, quietly, she said that he had put Emma in the car. The one with the lights on top. Judith sat very still. "Are you sure?" she asked her daughter. Karen nodded. "He told me not to tell anyone," she said. "He told me he would put me in the hole too." The room went completely still. Ellen Wright documented every word of that statement and, following mandatory reporting laws, contacted the Eugene Police Department within the hour. Within 24 hours, the file had been transferred to Douglas County. The case of Emma Rose Gibson, missing since the 18th of March, 1998, was officially reopened. Detectives arrived at Judith's home 2 days later and listened carefully as she laid out the full timeline. The move to Montana. The deterioration of the marriage. The nightmares Karen had been having for years. The drawing she had found tucked under the pillow. The words Karen had whispered in the dark. They asked about Larry's temper. About moments she had explained away. And Judith, for the first time, told them. There had been incidents. Small ones at first. A chair thrown when Karen spilled juice on the floor. Shouting so sudden and so loud that the baby had started screaming and could not be calmed for an hour. She had told herself it was stress. She had told herself it was grief. She had told herself it was what happened to a man who had been through what he had been through. She was no longer sure what to call it. As the detectives were leaving, one of them paused at the door. "We will need to talk to him," he said quietly. Investigators also tracked down Larry's half-sister, Debbie Call, who had been living in Iowa throughout this entire period. Debbie had maintained a close friendship with Judith after the separation, though her contact with Larry himself had ended years before. When Judith told her on the phone that the case had been reopened, Debbie went silent for several seconds. Then she said, "I think I need to tell you something." A few days later, she gave her official statement to police. She described a late-night telephone call she had received from Larry in the spring of 1998, weeks after Emma had disappeared. His voice, she said, was frantic. Uneven. Nothing like the composed, controlled man she had known all her life. He said, "I think I killed her." Those were his exact words. She asked what he meant. He said it was an accident. That it all happened too fast. Then he hung up. Debbie had not gone to the police at the time. She had told herself he was having a breakdown. She had told herself there had to be another explanation. She told the investigators she had been living with that decision for 3 years and would spend the rest of her life wishing she had made a different one. Her testimony, combined with Karen's forensic statement and all the physical inconsistencies from 1998, the jogging time, the patrol car mileage, the 2 bullets they found in the cat, gave the investigators what they needed. On the 14th of April, 2001, 2 plainclothes officers from Oregon drove to Cedar Street in Helena, Montana, and knocked on the front door of the quiet house where Larry Gibson had been living alone. He opened the door. He stepped aside. He let them in without a word. "I figured this would come eventually," he said. The house was tidy. Curtains drawn against the afternoon light. The sink was clean. On a shelf near the window sat a framed photograph of Emma, the little girl grinning beneath a paper birthday hat, frozen in a moment from a world that had stopped existing 3 years ago. The officers read him his rights. They cuffed him gently. They led him out to the waiting car. As they passed the neighbor's front lawn, a woman who was watering her garden stopped and stared. Larry met her eyes briefly. He nodded. And then he was gone. He was extradited to Oregon within the week. The grand jury indictment was returned quickly. State of Oregon vs. Larry Dean Gibson. Second-degree murder. In connection with the death of Emma Rose Gibson, age 2. When news of the arrest reached Eugene, Judith felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. The past she had spent 3 years trying to outrun was suddenly at her front door again. She cooperated fully with investigators, providing every document and letter she still had from their marriage. Old colleagues from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department were interviewed one more time. Some admitted, quietly and carefully, that even back in 1998 the story had never sat right with them. "We wanted to believe him," one said. "He was one of us. But the timeline never fit. It never fit from the beginning." The prosecutors assembled a narrative of rage and consequence. A moment of anger that went too far. A fatal mistake. A cover-up sustained for 3 years with the practiced discipline of a man who had spent his entire professional life asking other people to tell the truth. They did not claim he had planned it. They claimed only that when it happened, he had chosen concealment over confession. He had chosen silence over his daughter. Through his attorney, Larry Gibson issued a single statement to the press. "I am innocent of these accusations. I have no idea what happened to my daughter." When the charges were read aloud in the courtroom, murder in the second degree, Larry Gibson stood perfectly still and showed no reaction at all. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. As he was led from the room, a voice from somewhere in the back of the courtroom said, "That is the deputy who lost his kid." And another voice, from somewhere close by, replied, "That is the one who killed her." Judith did not attend the hearing. She stayed home with her daughters, the blinds drawn, the telephone off the hook. For the first time in 3 years, she said afterward, she felt something she could only describe as clarity. Sharp and terrible and real. The silence that had governed her life since the morning of the 18th of March, 1998, was finally over. Emma Rose Gibson's body was never recovered. No physical remains were ever found on the property, in the creek, in the fields, or in the forest beyond. The case built against her father rested entirely on inconsistency, on testimony, and on the fragile and persistent memory of a little girl who had been told not to speak and who had carried the weight of that silence for 3 years before she finally did. Karen went back to drawing after the arrest. The figures in her pictures were brighter. There were fewer shadows in the corners of the page. But always, in every drawing she made in those months, there was one shape missing from the group. One figure that was not there. When her teachers asked about it, she said the same thing she had always said. "It just feels right." In Elia, Oregon, the house at the end of the gravel road had new curtains in the windows and a new family's name on the mailbox. The swing in the yard had been replaced. But the creek behind the property still moved quietly over smooth stones, the way it had on the morning of the 18th of March, 1998, when a 2-year-old girl with blonde curls last pushed her yellow toy truck across the wet lawn, lifted one small hand in a wave, and said goodbye. Some mornings are ordinary until they are not. And some silences last exactly as long as the person holding them can bear to keep them. Emma Gibson's silence was broken by her sister. And that, in the end, was the only thing that brought the truth to the surface. Emma Rose Gibson was 2 years old. She deserved better than silence. She deserved better than a yard, a wave, and a goodbye that no one came back from. If this case moved you, if it made you feel the weight of it, do something right now. Share this video with one person. Drop Emma's name in the comments. Leave a case you want us to cover next. We read every single comment on this channel, and every name you leave here matters. Subscribe to 247 Studio Missing Cases. Hit the bell. Like this video. Because every case we cover is a name that deserves not to be forgotten. 247 Studio Missing Cases, we cover the ones they stopped talking about. 247 Studio Missing Cases. Like, comment, subscribe, share, and thank you for watching.